When we think of border states in the Civil War, we often think about Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Delaware. When we think of fugitive slaves, we often think of the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line as a boundary between slavery and freedom. But did you know that similar debates over the meaning of freedom and slavery occurred in the Washington Territory? Join us today for a discussion with a former research fellow who will explain how she came across a fugitive slave in Washington Territory and what his story tells us about fugitivity and freedom in a border region, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the host of Kentucky Chronicles. I'm the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, and I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which brings in researchers from across the world to conduct research in the rich archival holdings of the Kentucky Historical Society. Dr. Lorraine McConaghy is a public historian. She received a PhD in history from the University of Washington. In 2010-11, she received a fellowship to conduct research on Richard Dickerson Gholson, a Kentuckian who became the third Territorial Governor of Washington. We are here today, however, to talk about Dr. McConaghy's book that she co-authored with Judy Bentley, Free Boy, A True Story of Slave and Master. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I enjoy catching up with former fellows and talking about what they have been up to since they visited us. But before we discuss the book itself, can you tell us a little bit about the research process? When did you come across the story of Charlie Mitchell, and how soon did you know that you wanted to tell his story?
Well, it was professional. I was the historian at the Museum of History and Industry in Seattle for about 25 years, and part of my job was when a national traveling show came to Seattle to root the story, whatever the narrative was, into a local experience. So it didn't just land in a gallery like a meteorite. So we had an exhibit coming called Lincoln, the Constitution, and the Civil War in 2008. And so, oh God, I have to come up with a Civil War story for Washington Territory. And I had been told all my coming up that there really were no such stories because people went west to forget all that. People went west to get rich, to put in an orchard, to find gold. So I despaired a bit, and then I went to the microfilm thinking, even though territorial people couldn't vote in the presidential election of 1860, they would have been interested because the newspaper was published in the capital of the territory, that's Olympia, and so many of the appointees and people who had honest jobs getting a paycheck in Olympia were appointed by the sitting president, who was either either Franklin Pierce or James Buchanan, two Democrats in a row, right? So it's a very heavily politicized place. And with the Democratic Party split in two in the 1860 presidential election, running both Breckinridge and Douglas as presidential candidates split over slavery, the sort of come from behind Abraham Lincoln with the brand new Republican Party, that would maybe interest people in Washington Territory because so much of their livelihoods depended on it. So I went to the newspaper, started to read on microfilm, since 2008, and I began to gather the story of the territory's participation. And of course, people brought their ideas with them. They didn't leave them behind in, wherever they came from, whether that was Europe, Asia, Africa, or Kentucky. So I'm reading, taking notes, and I see this little headline that says fugitive slave case. And I thought, oh, this newspaper does publish a lot of national news. I've been doing some work on Cincinnati. Maybe this is about a slave who came over from Covington. So I started to read the article, and it was about a slave who had escaped in Washington Territory. And this was brand new to me, and I thought it would be brand new to many of the museum's visitors. And as I began to develop the exhibit more fully, I learned about pro-Confederate sympathizers in Washington Territory, a pro-Confederate armed militia there, the ongoing, Charles's escape in September of 1860 to the freedom of Victoria from the slavery in Olympia. It was a flashpoint for conversation in the territory about race, which included Native people, as well as people of color. So that's a long answer to a good short question.
No, that's a very good answer, though, because as I was reading the book and I was thinking about some of this, in my mind, I think even at the time, west as Missouri, maybe going out towards Texas, you don't often think of Washington Territory. And then the way you started explaining throughout the book and all these issues that you see in Kentucky are also playing out in a territory as far away, seemingly, as Washington. I had never thought about fugitive slaves in that area, so that just sort of blew my mind. But to give our listeners a little bit of background here, your title is Free Boy, A True Story of Slave and Master, and it mainly revolves around two people, Charlie Mitchell and James Tilton. Can you tell us, I know you dipped into it a little in that last question, but a little bit about Charlie's background and how he ended up enslaved by James Tilton?
Okay, so Charles Mitchell was born in 1847 on the Marengo plantation in Talbot County, Maryland. And that plantation had been owned for generations by the Gibson family. It was a tobacco plantation. And by 1850, the land was played out. I
Mhm.
guess tobacco really does destroy the land it's grown on. And there's this national slave census in 1850 that enumerates the family within which Charles Mitchell was born. And we know that his father was a white oyster fisherman on the Chesapeake Bay, and his mother was an enslaved woman in the house in the Marengo home. Um, and we know nothing about the circumstances of that relationship. Was it a rape? Was it, a love
Mhm.
affair? I don't know that. And we don't know Charles Mitchell's birth date. So when you look at the slave census in 1850, you see this constellation of women who were undoubtedly included Charles Mitchell's mother, aunts, grandmother, and so forth. So the Gibson plantation is declining. Rebecca Gibson is the last um, Gibson to live on the plantation. She sells all her enslaved people south, preparing to leave the plantation, but she keeps Charles Mitchell. Why does she do that? There's a family story in the Gibson family that in the cholera epidemic of 4950, Charles Mitchell's mother fell ill, and as she was dying, she told her mistress, "Take good care of my Charlie." So Gibson did not sell the boy, but kept him with her when she left the plantation, and then gave him like a gift to James Tilton, who was heading to Washington Territory. you know, fawning political toadies get appointments. And
Yes.
he got an appointment in Washington as the surveyor general. And he was, trained surveyor. It's not totally fake. But he took his family, he took his household, and that included this little black child who was 5 or 6 and who grew up in Washington Territory through the treaty imposition, negotiation by the federal government through the rebellion against the treaties. His owner, Charles Mitchell, or his owner, James Tilton, was responsible for building the blockade in Olympia against the attacks of enraged Native people who finally realized how demeaning and tough the treaty was going to be. So that would mean, for local people, the execution of Chief Leshai, the imposition of martial law. This was a very interesting time to grow up in Olympia. And this boy, Charles Mitchell, was not the only person of color in the area in which he lived. There's a free black couple, the Howards, who owned and managed a restaurant in Olympia, the Pacific House. Out in the country, there's a large family, the George Washington Bush family, a family of color that had an enormous farm. We don't know a lot. You do research, you set out with all these research questions and try to answer them with the preponderance of the best evidence. And it was just almost impossible to find out what the boy's relationship was with other people of color in the community. So it was something of a failure in a way to do this research, but something of a success as well.
You got enough for a book, so I always consider that once you can tease out those stories. But to flip the script just a little bit, you mentioned the political toady. I really like that. Can you tell us a little bit more about Tilton? I mean, just to go through a quick list here, he fights in the U.S. Mexican War, he campaigns for Franklin Pierce, he then gets appointed Surveyor General. So he himself lives a very interesting life. Can you just tell us a little bit about his perspective, that sort of half of the story?
Yes. So the Tiltons and the Gibsons had intermarried for generations, and they were all cousins of one another. So there's a very close relationship there. But the Tilton side of the family had left plantation life behind, and they were professionals, attorneys, doctors, surveyors, and they'd moved north to Delaware. And sort of out of the Gibson kind of crop raising uh, way of life. And the war with Mexico, I think, hardened the attitudes of a lot of soldiers, particularly those from slaveholding states, about
Hmm.
what brown people, what black people were like. So Richard Dickerson Gholson, for instance, who became the third governor of Washington Territory and who was from Ballard County, Kentucky, his going to Mexico shaped and hardened his racial ideas, and the same thing happened to Tilton. So receiving Charles Mitchell as a gift underlines the findings of the Dred Scott decision, which are 1857, that Dred Scott could not sue for his freedom because he was not a citizen. He was a parcel. He was a chattel, a piece of property. And the Dred Scott decision legitimized slavery in the territories. So you can look at the new maps that show where slavery was allowed, in the sense that if you owned a person, that property ownership, the Dred Scott decision held, could not be interfered with when you took your slave with you to territory that had not yet become a state. So just south of Washington Territory, Oregon entered statehood in 1859, and they had a plebiscite and decided that they would outlaw slavery in their state, but they also barred free black people from their state. So statehood confers opportunities to make policy changes like that, that territorial status did not. So when James Tilton had Charles Mitchell in Olympia, he wrote that his intent was to free him at the age of 18, having schooled him, churched him, and trained him to be a steward on a steamer on Puget Sound. So there's a kind of racialized uh, job hierarchy on board a steamer. And the person who does the laundry is always of Chinese descent. The person who is the cook is almost always of African descent. And that's true on a number of steamers I can think of on Puget Sound, a kind of interesting phenomenon. Whether that was Tilton's intent or not, I'm not sure. His personal letters indicate that he thought of Charles Mitchell as the property of Rebecca Gibson, and that he was essentially on loan to Tilton. But all of that evidence was very tinged with emotion after Charles Mitchell fled, because the last piece about James Tilton is that Charles Mitchell's escape hardened his attitudes further about African American people. And he was eternally angry that Charles Mitchell rebelled against his benefactors. That's the way James Tilton saw himself, or affected to see himself. And that when Tilton finally ran in 1865 for the position of territorial delegate, he ran as a cut and dried, out and out racist.
Hmm.
And again, in Washington Territory, this is African American people, but it is also Asian people, and it is also Native American people. So the racial pattern here is different, but Tilton's response was the same to all.
Yeah, he has. I mean, it seems almost if he can do whatever he wants, but he keeps coming back politically, which was really interesting to me. It doesn't seem to harm his career until later when he sort of finds himself on the outs. But to get back to something you were just talking about, and I do want to really quickly deal with this. Can you tell us a little bit about Mitchell's path to freedom? How does he end up in Victoria, and what's sort of the response to that? Because again, We talked about this before we went on the air. In Kentucky, we typically think Ohio River and people escaping from slavery that way. How does this become sort of a borderland or a path for the Underground Railroad in Washington Territory?
Well, I have to begin by confessing that Charles Mitchell is the only enslaved person I know of for sure who crossed the long border up into what we would now call British Columbia. The newspapers in the territory speculated on other routes, land routes, to the east of the Cascade Mountains up into Canada, but research so far has not turned up who might have taken that route. Charles Mitchell, let's see, back up. Victoria was 25% African American in 1860. That is a lot. And
Yes.
the reason for that was a mass migration of people of color from California, which was a state that had voted to bar slavery in the state. But there's a lot of ambiguity about how that law would be enforced. So the story of Archie Lee is probably the best well known. This young man, African American, who was brought into California, and then his master hired his labor out and kept his wages. So he's not picking cotton, but he is still enslaved. It's like Frederick Douglass was a shipwright, and he was not picking cotton, but he was still enslaved. So 500 African American men, women, and children left San Francisco, left California, and they had scouted out where they might go: Panama, Mexico, Vancouver Island. So they ended up going to Victoria because the governor of Vancouver Island had been cordial to them, Governor Douglas. So the Pioneer Committee, as they called themselves, bankrolled the transit to Canada of those who could not afford to go. 500 is a lot. And
Mhm.
they came to Canada with their own ideas. And one of their number was Mifflin Gibbs, who wrote an autobiography. And he had had considerable experience with the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. I cannot prove that he originated the idea of creating an underground railroad for enslaved people in Washington Territory, because there are a lot of experienced, prominent, capable African Canadians now who were in Victoria. But whoever came up with the idea, there were three men who carried it out: William Jerome, William Davis, and James Allen. We are so fortunate to know the names of the three African Canadian men who created the Underground Railroad. James Allen was a steward on board the Eliza Anderson, which was a steamer that plied the route between Victoria and Olympia. It's a mail steamer, essentially, although it carried passengers too. And he had observed Charles Mitchell in the street of Olympia, and I mean street singly, it was a very small place. And he approached two other friends, William Jerome and William Davis, and they approached Charles Mitchell in secret in Olympia to plan to hatch this Underground Railroad scheme where Charlie, as he was called before his emancipation, would come down to Percival Landing on the water at dawn on September 24th, 1860, and he would be very quiet. And the steward, James Allen, would be looking for him and gesture him on board and race down the companionway and hide Charles Mitchell in the cupboard, in the pantry. It must have been large enough to fit a 12-year-old boy. So Charles Mitchell was hidden dawn on September 24th, and James Allen kept making chicken and doing whatever he was doing to feed the people on board the ship as it left the dock in Olympia. So it stopped along the way at Fort Steilacoom, which is a U.S. Army base, and then in Seattle, which was a very small place at that time. But the desertion epidemic in the U.S. Armed Services was huge in the West. This sort of opportunistic, I want land, I want love, I want gold, let me out, people escaping. So a group of an Army officer with a group got on board the Eliza Anderson in Seattle and searched for deserters heading to Canada, and they found Charles Mitchell. So the captain of the ship decided to impose the Fugitive Slave Act here. And John Fleming was his name. And he said to Charlie, I have seen you at James Tilton's house in Olympia. I have seen you serving dinner. You're his property. I'm going to take you to Victoria because I have to go. And then we're going to go back to Olympia, you and me. So we had Charles Mitchell coaling the boiler, and they got to Victoria and they were met by a large crowd of what the newspaper called Black supporters and their white humanitarian allies. I think that's the phrase. I mean, there's no internet, right? So
Hmm.
the boat was expected. It was expected that Charles Mitchell would be on it, but Captain Fleming said he's not getting off this boat to the crowd. So the three men I've mentioned, so James Allen gets off the ship, William Jerome and William Davis, they go to a barrister's house and they fill out affidavits. So this is part of the pattern of primary source documents that we have. We have three affidavits from these three men about the conditions under which they knew Charles Mitchell was enslaved and getting him to Victoria. The barrister took those affidavits to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, essentially, of Victoria, who issued a writ of habeas corpus, saying that the captain had no right to imprison Charles Mitchell against his will. The captain appealed to international law, where on board a ship in the water, a captain is, king, really.
Right.
And- But the sheriff said, no way, we're going to exercise this writ of habeas corpus. And the situation got quite ugly, with mutual threats to break one another's heads, as was the phrase at the time. But eventually, Charles Mitchell set foot on the dock in Victoria. And that is the beginning. You set foot on British soil in 1860, and you are no longer a slave.
Mm.
So the sheriff took Charles to the lockup overnight. The next day, the court heard his case and freed him. The newspaper, the Victoria Colonist, called this a righteous decision, which is a lovely phrase. But back in Washington Territory, the newspaper coverage was far from thrilled. And that is where the title of our book, Free Boy, comes from. That Charlie had been very happy, the newspaper
Hmm.
reporter wrote, until these flashy looking darkies from Victoria had come down to interfere with the affections of his benefactors. So having kids analyze the language of these primary source documents has been a really rich experience.
Yeah, I was really impressed even as I was working through the book. The newspaper coverage was fascinating as well, and to see the sort of divisions between, okay, here's what's going on in Canada, here's what's being repeated in the United States, here's the divergence, and then how you get into those sort of territorial disputes as well, as in, okay, this is the United States, this isn't Canada, this is not Great Britain, they don't control us, we can do what we want. And that sort of back and forth was also very interesting, given the amount of dislike for Great Britain that you see in most of the territories throughout the 19th century.
That's exactly true. And Richard Gholson from Ballard County, Kentucky, was governor of Washington at this time. And it was known that he was a slaveholder back in Kentucky. And there are sort of jokes in the Portland papers and in the Western Washington papers that he would bring back his slaves with him when he came to Washington Territory after he was on a sort of leave at the time Charles Mitchell fled. There's also a report, I mean, again, this is in the context of the Dred Scott decision. This is
Mhm.
pre-Civil War, that agents who dealt in enslaved people had been in touch with logging mill owners, loggers, lumber mill owners, to encourage them to purchase enslaved men to work in the woods and the mills rather than hiring local white labor. So this is there's a lot more research to be done. It's it's not easy research. You look at a lot to find a little, but I
Mhm.
continue to be interested in this period of time. This antebellum period is very interesting in Washington Territory.
And you do a great job of telling that story. But to move forward just a little bit, most of this takes place sort of the late 1850s. How does the Civil War change the dynamics? What sort of happens in Washington Territory? As you mentioned, there's a lot of individuals who are pro-slavery or pro-South throughout the 1850s, including Tilton. What sort of changes over time, or what sort of the reaction to the outbreak of the Civil War with these different groups that have been fighting amongst themselves over the type of territory that they want to be?
Well, it's nicely complicated.
Yes.
So James Tilton did not go south. He stayed in Washington Territory. Richard Dickerson Gholson did go south. He went to Texas, then to Kentucky, and then to Tennessee. And I'm interested in his biography. That's why I keep mentioning Gholson. The Kentucky Historical Society fellowship that I had dealt with Gholson. And I have one big, huge unanswered research question, but if I can ever get it answered, I'll do an article about him. But back in the territory, many people left. One guy walked all the way to Indiana from Washington Territory to join the Union Army. Many others resigned their commissions in the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Army to go south. So they took the steamer down to San Francisco and then got themselves over to whatever state they were from. There's a very strong emphasis. I'm a Virginian, I'm a Texan. So it's not so much I'm a citizen of the US, it's the state that you're from.
Mm-hmm.
So there are no battles in Washington Territory, but there are fistfights. And people stopped being friends because of the issues raised by the Civil War. The Knights of the Golden Circle are not only a phenomenon in Washington Territory, they're national, but they are the pro-Confederate armed militia that I mentioned a while ago. And they had chapters in Washington Territory, and they would drill with weapons. And the governor of the new state of Oregon was worried enough about the intent of the Knights of the Golden Circle that he hired spies to infiltrate the Knights of the Golden Circle. And that file is at the Oregon Historical Society. It's the most that we know about how the Knights of the Golden Circle functioned. So their goal was to take out Washington, Oregon, California, and bring that reverse L, so across to Arizona and New Mexico into the Confederacy. Think what that would have meant in terms of the gold in California that would then have been available to the Confederate States of America Treasury. Did it happen? No. Was it a dream? Yes. Is it important? You bet.
Yes.
There are a number of attempts to seize gold-bearing ships by pro-Confederate, I don't know, privateers, boarding parties coming out of California. But Washington Territory has the Knights of the Golden Circle. There are a number of people of color who are not free like the Howards or the Bushes, living in ambiguous circumstances, Daniel, and it's hard to know just by looking why this person of color is living in this white family. And to inquire, more than 150 years later, what were the circumstances of this person living in the home? But there's a very strong division between Democrats and Republicans in Washington Territory. Once Lincoln comes into office, the new fawning political toadies are Republicans, and the old ones, the Democrats, are gone. So there's this upheaval in the newspapers, in attitudes, and one can trace some of this in correspondence because some of these people are elite enough that their correspondence has been saved. But the internationalism that you mentioned, Dan, is very prevalent, where there was a fear that Victoria shipyards would harbor Confederate war steamers in the Pacific and help them crew up and water up and supply up, and that they would then come down into Puget Sound. And there's repeated warnings in the Republican press in Washington Territory that those Confederate steamers, like the Shenandoah, would level every sawmill on Puget Sound. So the internationalism there is concern that Great Britain will come in on the side of the Confederacy, either just recognizing it as a nation, as a government, or actually actively supporting it. So we had a consul, Alan Francis, in Victoria at the time, and the National Archives holds his papers. They're the best source I could find um, to support the newspaper accounts of the battles in the streets of Victoria. We've got this very large African American population that has become African Canadian. We have US Navy ships putting in there. We have Confederate States Navy ships putting in there. And there's many accounts of all kinds of fist fights in the streets, defacement of property, slogans painted in the night. And this kind of sets the context for, as the war ends, many, not all, but many of the people of color who had moved to Victoria in the first place moved back to the States. And that included Charles Mitchell.
The political situation really interested me because in Kentucky, we don't have, I mean, it's a state by the Civil War, and it has been for a long time, so you don't have the political appointees. So the Republican Party tries to get started, but they never really gain headway. So it was very interesting to me to see how that plays out in Washington Territory, where you start to have those Republican appointees, but they actually start getting power to a degree that you never see in a state like Kentucky, where the Democratic Party just rushes, right back into power post-Civil War, where to see Tilton end up sort of losing contests because he's deemed to be a copperhead or, pro-South, that was a very interesting twist to me that I think from my experience in Kentucky, I hadn't expected or thought about how that would play out.
Well, the big unanswered question about Gholson from Ballard County, who went south to Tennessee, he had raised a cavalry unit in Kentucky, and he worked very hard to encourage Kentucky to secede, saying, this is our economy is slaveholding, regardless of what our political divisions may be. And Jefferson Davis would want us, Jeff Davis, as he called him, would want us to secede as a whole, not to break into Western and Eastern Kentucky. So he raised this cavalry unit in Ballard County. And William Wallace Faulkner was the lieutenant that he appointed to that group. And when Kentucky did not secede, Gholson sold his crops in the late summer, early fall of 1861, took his family and his enslaved people and the cavalry unit and went straight south to Obion County, Tennessee. And there we see William Wallace Faulkner emerge as a border guerrilla, ranging in and out of Kentucky and Tennessee. And the research question I've been trying to answer is, what did his relationship with Gholson consist in? What happened after Gholson went south to Tennessee and Faulkner went south to Tennessee? Because Gholson's descendant, who wrote the Wikipedia article on Gholson, Charles Gholson, said that Gholson died in Obion County, Tennessee, slamming into a tree on a buckboard with an enslaved man by his side. Was he supplying William Wallace Faulkner? I am hoping that someone listening to this podcast may have more knowledge than I do, and be able to bail me out here. There are also conflicting opinions or narratives about Gholson's death itself. And some of these I learned at the Kentucky Historical Society on my fellowship there. So did he die slamming into a tree? Did he die of tuberculosis? Or did he die of old age? Those are very, very different.
No, I was going to say the tree one's very interesting. Die run into a tree would be quite a great hook for an article or book, just to lead into something with that. Yeah, but hopefully someone will have a bit more information on that. Kentucky, as you know, is somewhat a crazy place during the Civil War with so many different factions and groups. So tracing people down, it can be quite a challenge. But I did want to get back to this really quickly and just to wrap this all up and bring it all together. Can you give a short account of how things sort of end up for both Mitchell and Tilton, and maybe speak a little bit to the challenges? You've alluded to this throughout the podcast today, but the challenges of a researcher when you don't have a lot on what happens post-war. I know there's significantly more, it seemed like, on Tilton, but how does the story sort of wrap up, and what were some of the challenges of telling that story?
When we published the book, Judy Bentley and I, in 2013, we did not know what became of Charles Mitchell. And one of the realities of, finally taking the risk and publishing something is that people will say, oh, I know much more than that. So we had researched Charles Mitchells's of the right ethnicity, the right age, the right gender in the Canadian and US census again and again, all over the place. And there were so many of them. But this one source said, oh, no, your Charles Mitchell moved to San Francisco after the war. And once we had that and could begin to trace him in that census, we were able to look at other primary records. He had come to San Francisco early enough to join the US Army at the end of the Civil War. So he was in uniform as the Civil War ends. That means he has military pension. That means there's that whole other slew of federal records. So he became a sailor. He married a woman from Great Britain, a white woman, and brought her back to San Francisco. I mean, we know his story, but we need a new edition of the book to extend the story. So he had a life, and who knows what would have happened had he stayed with the Tiltons in Washington Territory. The war ended slavery everywhere, so he wouldn't have been enslaved anymore. But where would he have gone? Would he have stayed on Puget Sound, stayed in Washington Territory? There's no telling, there's no knowing that. But he had a life, which was I think in Victoria, quite a wonderful life in the warmth and respect of this large Black Canadian community there. He was schooled at the preparatory school, a very good school to which one had to pay tuition. So, we can imagine his life in Victoria, but we do sort of know the general narrative of his life after Victoria. James Tilton's easy to research by comparison. It's not thin on the ground. He was a fairly prominent person. His name figures here and there. He continued his career as a surveyor. He ran for a territorial delegate in 1865 on this frankly racist platform, saying, okay, the Confederate States of America lost the war, but we do not want to be co-equal with people of any color here. And he lost to Arthur Denny, who was one of the newcomer founders of Seattle and a Whig who'd become a Republican. So Tilton's racial attitudes were hardened. There's a fair amount of suggestion that he was drinking very heavily, that he spent many, many evenings of the Civil War in a saloon in Olympia telling anybody who would listen that the South was being betrayed, that its own rights to exist were patently clear and apparent, and that it was being forced to remain in the Union. He went back east, but he became primarily the Northern Pacific's principal surveyor. And it is he who surveyed the route that finally came into Washington Territory and ended at Tacoma. He laid out on paper the grid of old Tacoma. And so his connection renewed to Washington Territory. So that pretty much, I think, winds that story up. But as a museum historian, and that's what I am primarily, I find these stories that link disparate areas so interesting. And the pathways back and forth, we think of people as much more settled than they really were. And there, with a will, there's a way. If you want to walk to Indiana to enlist, knock yourself out. Nobody's going to stop you. And there's just so many ways to move around the country that tracing someone like Gholson, who goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth from Kentucky to Washington Territory and San Francisco and Texas, where he also had plantations. He was a person of some means, but there are less expensive ways to go than Gholson did as well.
And that's quite a trek. I mean, when you're thinking about even today going Kentucky, to the West Coast, that's a long trek today. I can't imagine doing that regularly or even every couple of years. If you're Gholson, just going back and forth, that's got to be quite exciting. I did agree with you, though, because it is fascinating how these stories sort of link up. But I think the one thing I always appreciate and that I always enjoy having guests on is the stories that you all tell. It takes you a long time to find those documents. So for us to give you a chance to kind of highlight those stories. As I was reading, Tilton is decidedly unlikable. There's not a lot that you read and you go, okay, this guy has any redeeming qualities. But as you read Charlie Mitchell's story, it was one of those where I'm really glad that you were able to get his story out there and tell us all a little bit about that. And I appreciate your coming on today to share a little more about that.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Kentucky and Washington State might seem to have little history in common. Washington did not become a state until 1889, and its capital city, Olympia, is over 2,000 miles from Frankfort. Yet, as Dr. McConaghy shared with us today, both regions shared a common history. In both places, men like Charlie Mitchell could seek freedom by fleeing across the border. And in both places, men like James Tilton could try to use the legal system to attempt to reclaim their fugitive slave. We hope that today's discussion has shed light on the issues of fugitivity and freedom in a borderland region. We also hope that the discussion has reminded us all of the great sacrifices that enslaved people were willing to make to find freedom, no matter the physical obstacles that stood in their way. This brings another episode to a close. I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Lorraine McConaghy, for talking with me today. It is with a degree of sadness that I have to say that this will be my last episode hosting Kentucky Chronicles. In August 2022, we released our first episode of Kentucky Chronicles. Since then, I've interviewed 24 guests, taking our listeners on a journey through Kentucky's rich history. We have analyzed notorious murders, discussed the origins of the Kentucky Historical Society, and talked with experts about how Kentuckians experienced the Civil War. Some of our discussions have been quite serious, dealing with weighty issues such as slavery, immigration, and homicide. This has not prevented us from also enjoying the lighter side of Kentucky's history, such as the report of floating black cats after a major earthquake. Our goal from the beginning has been to bring you, the listener, the most up-to-date research on Kentucky history. Some of this has been published in books and in articles in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. Other scholars are still in the process of figuring out how to tell their stories, and we hope to have updates one day on the books and articles that result from their trips to the Kentucky Historical Society. I hope that each episode has highlighted the process of history, illustrating how historians wrestle with the past to uncover its meaning. Many of their journeys end with a publication, but it starts with a question. When I began conducting interviews, I was not sure if anyone would agree to come on a then unentitled podcast, and I feared that I would soon exhaust the stories that could be told. I quickly found out how wrong I was, as guests eagerly agreed to chat. I soon found myself with the enviable problem of having too many topics to explore. Just talking to former fellows at KHS would have filled out entire seasons of the podcast, to say nothing of the dozens of books that have been published based on research conducted at KHS. The good news is that Kentucky Chronicles is not drawing to a close. It will continue as a new host will take over. When I accepted a position as a historical publications specialist at the U.S. House of Representatives, one of my first thoughts was how difficult it would be to end my time as host of Kentucky Chronicles. I want to sincerely thank our producer, Greg Hardison, who has believed in the podcast from the start and who is responsible for the quality of the production. I do an interview, and I've been blessed to leave the rest in Greg's capable hands. I have sincerely enjoyed my time hosting Kentucky Chronicles, and I've been honored to explore Kentucky's history with you all. I will now be joining your ranks as one of the many people who enjoy listening to Kentucky Chronicles. I hope you will continue to support it as it heads into its third season. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation.